The Quiet Homecoming. Michael Brooks, a decorated African-American Air Force colonel, felt a surge of emotion as his plane touched down at the small military airstrip near his hometown. 8 months of grueling deployment had taken a toll, but tonight, that weight seemed lighter. He wasn't just coming home. He was returning to a life he cherished. A life where his wife Donna and his 2 children, Mia and Caleb, awaited his surprise arrival. The military Humvee that drove him to the base gates rumbled softly against the paved road. Michael exchanged pleasantries with the driver, a young airman named Ortiz, whose nervous admiration for the colonel was obvious. As they arrived at the visitor's lot, Michael grabbed his duffel bag, gave a final salute, and headed toward his parked sit-in. The sight of the car, dusty from months of neglect, but otherwise intact, brought a small smile to his face. As he slid into the driver's seat, he let out a deep sigh. The smell of old leather and a faint whiff of an air freshener his kids had picked out before he left. It all felt familiar, grounding. Starting the engine, he began his drive home. The city lights flickered like fireflies in the cool autumn air, casting a gentle glow on the quiet streets. It was late, and most people were tucked in bed. Michael had purposefully kept his return a secret. He wanted to see the unfiltered joy on his children's faces, to hold his wife in his arms without warning. Every mile brought him closer to the life he had fought to protect. He adjusted the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his tired but determined reflection. His uniform was neatly pressed, medals gleaming against the crisp fabric. But beneath the polished exterior was a man who had weathered more battles than he cared to count, both on and off the battlefield. Yet, as the streetlights blurred into streaks of golden light, his thoughts were not on war zones but on the warmth of home. The road ahead. The streets became quieter as Michael turned onto a familiar stretch of road, lined with oak trees whose leaves were painted in shades of amber and crimson. He lowered the window slightly, letting the crisp autumn breeze cool his face. There was an inexplicable serenity in that moment, a calmness he hadn't felt in months. But that serenity shattered when the unmistakable wail of a police siren cut through the air. Red and blue lights flashed behind him, illuminating the interior of his car with a strobe-like intensity. Michael frowned, glancing at his speedometer. He wasn't speeding, and as far as he could tell, he hadn't violated any traffic laws. Confused, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. His heart thudded against his chest, not from fear, but from the sheer unexpectedness of the situation. The patrol car stopped behind him, its engine humming softly. Michael watched in the mirror as a lone officer stepped out. The figure was silhouetted against the flashing lights, but as they approached, the beam of a flashlight pierced through the rear windshield, momentarily blinding him. Michael instinctively placed both hands on the steering wheel, a habit ingrained through years of experience and countless conversations about staying safe during traffic stops. The officer, a white woman with a stern expression, approached his window. Her nameplate read A. Hayes. "Driver, roll down your window," she barked. Her tone was cold, authoritative. Michael complied, rolling the window down slowly. "Good evening, officer," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered without preamble, her flashlight trained directly on his face. Michael hesitated. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked, keeping his hands visible. "License and registration," she snapped, ignoring his question. Michael gestured slowly toward the glove compartment. "I'm reaching for my registration," he said, ensuring every move was deliberate. Hayes didn't lower her flashlight. Her posture was rigid, her hand hovering near her holstered weapon. "Make it quick." Michael retrieved his documents and handed them over. As she scanned his license, her brows furrowed. "Michael Brooks?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "Yes, ma'am." "Is there a reason I've been stopped?" he asked again, his patience wearing thin. "We received a report about a stolen vehicle matching this description." "Step out of the car," she repeated, her voice sharper this time. The tension builds. Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The accusation felt like a slap to his dignity. "Officer, there must be a misunderstanding. I'm a colonel in the United States Air Force. I just returned from deployment." Hayes narrowed her eyes, as if his explanation only deepened her suspicion. "That doesn't exempt you from investigation. Step out now." Michael took a deep breath, suppressing the surge of frustration rising in his chest. He knew better than to argue. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, the cool night air hitting his face. The flashlight followed his every move, unyielding and intrusive. "Hands where I can see them," Hayes commanded. Michael complied, raising his hand slightly. "My military ID is in my jacket pocket. If you check it, you'll see." "Keep your hands where they are," she cut him off. "I'll decide when to check." The tension in the air was palpable. Michael felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, each second stretching into an eternity. The beam of the flashlight felt less like a tool and more like a weapon, stripping away his humanity and reducing him to a shadow of himself. He glanced around, noticing a few lights flickering on in nearby houses. Curtains twitched as curious eyes peeked out. Someone stepped onto their porch, their phone raised. Michael's jaw tightened. This was not the homecoming he had envisioned. Memories of another battle. As he stood there, hands raised, Michael couldn't help but think of another time he had felt this vulnerable, on a battlefield in a distant land. There, he had faced enemies who wanted nothing more than to see him fall. But this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was his home. Yet he felt no safer. The sound of a second patrol car pulling up snapped him back to the present. Another officer, this one older and male, stepped out. His nameplate read J. Miller. "Hayes, what's going on here?" Miller asked, his tone more measured. "Suspect matches the description from the report," Hayes replied, her grip on her flashlight unwavering. Miller's gaze shifted to Michael. "Colonel Brooks?" he asked, his expression softening slightly. "Yes, sir," Michael replied, his tone betraying the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "I've been trying to explain." Hayes interrupted. "We can't take any chances. He could be dangerous." Miller raised a hand, signaling her to lower her flashlight. "Hayes, let's confirm his identity before jumping to conclusions." For a moment, there was silence. Hayes looked hesitant, but eventually stepped back, though her posture remained tense. Miller approached Michael, his demeanor less confrontational. "Colonel, may I see your ID?" Michael nodded. "It's in my jacket pocket." Miller retrieved the ID, his eyes scanning the card before handing it back. "Thank you for your service, Colonel." But Hayes wasn't convinced. "That doesn't prove anything." "The description. It proves he's not a threat." Miller interjected firmly. "We're done here." An uneasy departure. The tension didn't dissolve immediately. Even as Hayes reluctantly returned to her patrol car, her eyes lingered on Michael, suspicion still etched into her features. Miller apologized briefly before following her. As the patrol cars drove away, Michael stood by his car, the quiet night once again enveloping him. But the peace he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a bitter taste of injustice. Sliding back into the driver's seat, Michael took a moment to compose himself. He looked into the rearview mirror, his reflection a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. This wasn't the reunion he had imagined, but it was a stark reminder of the battles he still had to fight, both for his family and for the principles he believed in. He started the car, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, and resumed his journey home. A lesson unfolds. Michael Brooks pulled into the driveway of his suburban home, the hum of his engine fading into the cool autumn night. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sat there for a moment, his mind replaying the humiliating traffic stop. The weight of the officer's flashlight on his face, the cold suspicion in her tone, and the implicit accusation burned into his memory. It wasn't fear that had consumed him. It was frustration, anger, and a deep, gnawing sadness. This wasn't the homecoming he had envisioned. The plan to surprise his wife and kids had already been overshadowed by an encounter that left him questioning how far society had truly progressed. But Michael knew he couldn't let his disappointment taint the reunion with his family. With a heavy sigh, he stepped out of the car, grabbed his duffel bag, and made his way to the front door. The porch light cast a warm glow as he fumbled for the spare key hidden under a potted plant. Quietly unlocking the door, he stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of lavender from the diffuser his wife Dana loved so much. He set his bag down, closed the door gently, and stood for a moment in the silence of the home he had missed so deeply. "Mia, Caleb," he called softly, his voice echoing through the house. No response. Michael frowned slightly but noticed the faint glow of the television from the living room. As he approached, he found Dana curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her, and their 2 children fast asleep on either side of her. The sight melted the tension in his chest. For the first time that night, a genuine smile broke across his face. The surprise. Dana stirred as Michael knelt beside her, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. Her eyes fluttered open, and it took her a moment to register his presence. When she did, her gasp of surprise filled the room. "Michael," she whispered loudly, careful not to wake the kids. She threw her arms around him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "I didn't know you were coming home tonight." "That was the plan," Michael replied, his voice low and filled with warmth. "I wanted to surprise you." Dana pulled back, her hands resting on his face as she studied him. "You look exhausted. How was the trip?" Michael hesitated. The memory of the traffic stop was still fresh, but he didn't want to burden her with it. "Not now." "Long," he said simply, "but I'm home now, and that's all that matters." Dana smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. She kissed him softly before turning her attention to the kids. "Mia and Caleb are going to be so excited when they wake up." Michael glanced at his children, their peaceful faces a stark contrast to the turmoil he had felt just hours earlier. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of world they were growing up in, a world where their father, a decorated officer, could be treated as a suspect based solely on the color of his skin. The dinner table conversation. The next morning, the house buzzed with excitement. Maya and Caleb were ecstatic to see their father, bombarding him with stories about school, friends, and everything he had missed while he was away. Michael soaked it all in, their laughter and chatter like a balm to his weary soul. As the family gathered around the breakfast table, Dana noticed Michael's unusual quietness. "Are you okay?" she asked gently, placing a hand on his. Michael hesitated. He had always been careful about what he shared with his family, not wanting to burden them with the harsh realities of his experiences. But this time felt different. His silence wasn't just about protecting them. It was about protecting himself from reliving the humiliation. "I'm fine," he said after a moment. "Just tired." Dana didn't press further, but her eyes lingered on him, a mix of concern and curiosity. Michael knew she could sense there was more to the story, but he wasn't ready to share it. Not yet. The school assembly invitation. Later that afternoon, as Michael was unpacking his duffel bag, he heard a knock at the front door. Opening it, he found Mia's teacher, Mrs. Cartwright, standing on the porch with a warm smile. "Colonel Brooks, welcome home," she greeted. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Michael replied, shaking her hand. "What can I do for you?" "Well," Mrs. Cartwright began, "Mia mentioned you were coming home soon, and we're having a Veterans Day assembly at school next week. We'd be honored if you could speak to the students about your experiences." Michael hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he particularly enjoyed, but the thought of sharing his story with young minds, including his daughter and her classmates, was appealing. Perhaps it was an opportunity to inspire them, and to address some of the broader issues he had been grappling with. "I'd be happy to," he said finally. "Thank you for thinking of me." A familiar face. The week flew by, and before Michael knew it, the day of the assembly arrived. Dressed in his formal uniform, He felt a swell of pride as he walked into the school auditorium. The room was filled with students, parents, and faculty, their faces lighting up as they saw him. As he took his place on the stage, his eyes scanned the crowd. That's when he saw her, Officer Hayes. She was seated near the back, her expression unreadable. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected to see her here. As the program began, Michael listened to the other speakers, their stories of service and sacrifice resonating deeply. When it was his turn, he stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The speech. "Good morning," Michael began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "My name is Colonel Michael Brooks, and I've had the honor of serving in the United States Air Force for the past 20 years. Over those years, I've learned many lessons about leadership, resilience, and the importance of standing up for what's right." He paused, glancing briefly at Officer Hayes before continuing. "But the most important lesson I've learned is that true strength comes from understanding, not just of others, but of ourselves." Michael went on to share stories from his deployments, emphasizing the value of diversity and unity in overcoming challenges. He spoke about the prejudices he had encountered, both abroad and at home, and how they had shaped his perspective. "As a soldier, I faced enemies who were different from me in every way: language, culture, beliefs. But what I've learned is that understanding those differences doesn't make us weaker, it makes us stronger. It allows us to see each other as human beings, not as threats." He paused again, his gaze returning to Hayes. "And sometimes, understanding requires us to confront our own biases, to question the assumptions we make about others based on how they look or where they come from." The room was silent, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. Michael could see the impact they were having. Students leaning forward in their seats, parents nodding in agreement, and even Hayes shifting uncomfortably. The confrontation. After the assembly, Michael was approached by a line of students and parents, all eager to thank him for his service and his words. But as the crowd thinned, he found himself face to face with Hayes. "Colonel Brooks," she began, her tone softer than he had expected, "I wanted to say, thank you. Your speech, it gave me a lot to think about." Michael studied her for a moment, searching her face for sincerity. "I'm glad to hear that," he said finally. "We all have room to grow, Officer Hayes, myself included." She nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I know I owe you an apology. For that night, I let my assumptions get the better of me." Michael's expression softened. "It's not just about apologizing, officer. It's about learning. About making sure it doesn't happen again, to anyone." Hayes looked up, her eyes meeting his. "I understand, and I'll do better." Michael extended a hand. After a brief hesitation, Hayes took it, the gesture feeling like the first step toward something better. Breaking barriers. Michael Brooks left the school auditorium that afternoon with a renewed sense of purpose. While his encounter with Officer Hayes had been unexpected, it planted a seed of hope that perhaps change was possible, even if it came one conversation at a time. The words he had spoken to her were not just for her benefit. They were also a reminder to himself. Growth wasn't easy, and it required confronting discomfort head-on. As he walked back to his car, the cool autumn breeze carried with it a whisper of optimism. But Michael knew that for every step forward, there would be challenges ahead. He was determined to address them, not just for himself, but for his family, his community, and the future he believed in. The community meeting. A week later, Michael found himself sitting at his kitchen table, sifting through the mail. Amid bills and advertisements, one envelope caught his attention. It bore the logo of the local community center and was addressed to him personally. Curious, he opened it and read the contents. The letter was an invitation to speak at a community forum about building trust between law enforcement and the citizens they served. The event was being organized in response to a growing number of incidents like the one Michael had experienced, incidents that highlighted the urgent need for dialogue and understanding. Michael hesitated, The idea of sharing his story in such a public and potentially contentious setting was daunting, but he also knew that his voice could make a difference. After a moment of reflection, he decided to accept the invitation. A divided room. The evening of the forum arrived quickly. The community center's main hall was packed, with residents filling every seat and standing along the walls. The atmosphere was tense, a mixture of anticipation and unease. On one side of the room sat members of the local police department, including Officer Hayes and her partner, Sergeant James Miller. On the other side were community members, many of whom had their own stories of being profiled or mistreated by law enforcement. Michael took his place on the stage alongside other speakers, which included a community activist, a police captain, and a local pastor. As the moderator introduced the panel, Michael scanned the crowd, noting the range of emotions etched on the faces before him: anger, skepticism, hope, and exhaustion. When it was his turn to speak, Michael stood and approached the podium. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Colonel Michael Brooks, and I'm honored to be here tonight. I'd like to start by sharing a story, my own." He recounted the events of the traffic stop, describing in vivid detail the fear, frustration, and helplessness he had felt. He didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths, nor did he demonize the officers involved. Instead, he framed the experience as a microcosm of a larger issue, one that required collective effort to address. "I'm not here to assign blame," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here to advocate for understanding. Because the truth is, both sides of this room are carrying pain, mistrust, and fear. And if we don't address that, together, nothing will change." The turning point. As Michael spoke, the tension in the room began to shift. His words resonated not because they were inflammatory, the dangers of the job, the split-second decisions they had to make, but he also emphasized the human cost of prejudice and the importance of accountability. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. But as the moderator opened the floor for questions and comments, the discussion quickly became heated. A young man in the audience stood up, his voice trembling with emotion. "Why should we trust the police when they see us as criminals first and human beings second?" he asked, his gaze fixed on the officers in the room. Officer Hayes shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was clear she wanted to respond, but the weight of the question, and the memories of her encounter with Michael, seemed to hold her back. Michael stepped in. "That's a valid question," he said, addressing the young man directly. "And it's one that can't be answered with words alone. Trust isn't something that can be demanded. It has to be earned, through actions and accountability." He turned to the officers. "But trust is a two-way street. Just as the community needs to see you as people, not just uniforms, you need to see them as individuals with unique stories, struggles, and strengths." A personal revelation. After the forum, Michael found himself surrounded by attendees who wanted to thank him or share their own experiences. Amid the crowd, he noticed Officer Hayes approaching, her expression a mix of resolve and vulnerability. "Colonel Brooks," she began, her voice quieter than he had expected, "I wanted to thank you for speaking tonight. And I need to tell you something." Michael nodded, giving her his full attention. "I grew up in a neighborhood where crime was a part of everyday life," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I saw people I cared about get hurt or worse. When I became a cop, I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting people like me from the kind of pain I'd seen growing up." She paused, her voice trembling slightly. "But somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats where there weren't any. That night I stopped you. I wasn't seeing you. I was seeing the fear I've been carrying for years. And that's on me." Michael's expression softened. "Acknowledging it is the first step," he said. "But what matters now is what you do going forward." Hayes nodded. "I'm committed to changing, and I hope we can work together to make that change real, not just for me, but for everyone." A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Michael and Hayes began collaborating on community outreach initiatives, including workshops and discussions aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and residents. Their efforts were met with both praise and skepticism, but they pressed on, fueled by a shared belief in the possibility of progress. One evening, as they wrapped up a particularly successful workshop, Hayes turned to Michael. "You know, if someone had told me a few months ago that I'd be working alongside the man I almost arrested, I wouldn't have believed them." Michael chuckled. "Life has a funny way of surprising us." Hayes smiled. "Thank you, Colonel, for everything." Michael nodded. "Thank you for being willing to grow. That's where real change begins." The ripple effect. The community outreach initiatives that Michael Brooks and Officer Amanda Hayes spearheaded began to take root, slowly but steadily. The workshops weren't just gatherings. They became spaces for healing, uncomfortable truths, and tentative hope. Michael and Amanda were becoming symbols of what change could look like when people dared to confront their biases and assumptions head-on. But not everyone embraced this change. Some resisted, others doubted, and a few outright opposed their efforts. Progress, Michael knew, was rarely linear. It was a battle that required resilience, understanding, and an unshakable commitment to the greater good. The pushback. One crisp autumn evening, Michael received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Stop pushing your agenda." Its contents were scathing, accusing him of being anti-police and out of touch with reality. The message ended with a chilling warning. "Stay in your lane, Colonel, or you'll regret it." Michael leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. He had faced enemies on the battlefield who were more direct in their threats. But this felt different. This was personal. This was home. He forwarded the email to Amanda, who called him minutes later. "Michael, are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "I'm fine," he said, "but this isn't just about me. It's about the work we're doing. Not everyone's ready for change." Amanda sighed. "I'll escalate this to my department. Whoever sent that needs to know there are consequences." Michael hesitated. "I don't want to turn this into a bigger fight. If we react too strongly, it might deter the progress we're making." "Progress isn't worth your safety," Amanda countered firmly. "I'll handle it discreetly." The community gathering. The article inspired a group of local businesses and faith leaders to organize a community gathering, inviting people from all walks of life to share their stories and ideas. The event was held in the town square on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Michael was one of the speakers, along with Amanda and several other community leaders. The atmosphere was lively, with food trucks, live music, and a children's play area. But the heart of the event was the open mic session, where anyone could step up and speak. A teenage boy named Marcus, his voice trembling, shared his experience of being stopped by police while riding his bike home from a friend's house. "They said I looked like someone they were looking for," he said, "but I was just a kid trying to get home." Amanda approached the mic next. "Marcus, I want to thank you for sharing your story," she began. "Hearing it reminds me of the responsibility I carry as an officer, not just to enforce the law, but to serve and protect every member of this community. Your voice matters, and it's helping me become better at my job." The crowd erupted into applause, and Marcus smiled shyly. For Michael, it was a moment that encapsulated everything he had been working toward: bridging gaps, building trust, and empowering others to speak their truth. The threat resurfaces. Despite the positive momentum, the anonymous threats against Michael persisted. One evening, as he walked to his car after a late meeting, he found a note on his windshield. It read, "You can't change the system. Stop trying." Michael crumpled the note, his resolve hardening. He knew that fear was the weapon of those who resisted progress, and he refused to let it deter him. That night, he called Amanda. "We need to talk," he said. "Not just about the threats, but about how we can protect what we've built. This is bigger than us now." Building a coalition. In the weeks that followed, Michael and Amanda expanded their efforts, forming a coalition of community leaders, educators, business owners, and law enforcement officers. Their goal was to create a long-term strategy for fostering understanding and accountability. The coalition launched several initiatives, including mentorship programs for at-risk youth, cultural competency training for police officers, and a community advisory board to oversee police practices. Each step was met with challenges, but the coalition's commitment never wavered. One of the most impactful initiatives was a storytelling series where residents shared personal experiences with law enforcement, both positive and negative. These stories were compiled into a documentary that premiered at the local theater, drawing a large audience. As the credits rolled, Michael felt a sense of pride. The work was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. A glimmer of hope. On a quiet evening, months after the documentary's premiere, Michael received an unexpected visitor. It was Marcus, the teenager who had shared his story at the community gathering. He was holding a letter in his hand. "Colonel Brooks," Marcus said, "I wanted to thank you. Your work helped me believe that things can get better. I wrote an essay about my experience for a contest, and I won. I'm thinking about going into law enforcement one day to be part of the change." Michael's throat tightened as he read the letter. It was a powerful reminder of why he had started this journey: to inspire hope, foster understanding, and create a better future. He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You already are part of the change," he said. The unseen battle. Michael Brooks had always believed in the power of resilience. Throughout his military career, it had been his guiding principle, a beacon that kept him grounded in the chaos of war zones and the complexities of leadership. Yet, as he stood in the kitchen of his home, sipping his coffee and staring at the latest anonymous letter threatening him to abandon his efforts, he realized the battles at home could be just as harrowing. This battle wasn't fought with weapons or tactics. It was fought with persistence, empathy, and unyielding determination to dismantle deeply rooted prejudices. And as much as Michael wanted to keep his family insulated from the tensions, the ripples of his work were beginning to reach his home. The family's unease. That morning, as Michael sat down at the breakfast table, his wife, Donna, placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. She lingered by his side, her brow furrowed with worry. "You've been quiet," she said, sitting across from him. "More than usual." Michael sighed, setting down his mug. "Another letter," he admitted. This one was more direct. Dana's eyes widened. "Michael, this is getting dangerous. I support what you're doing. But what if something happens? To you? To us?" He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Nothing's going to happen," he said, though the weight in his voice betrayed his words. "I won't let it." Mia, their 12-year-old daughter, walked in, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Dad, are you going to that thing at school today?" she asked, referencing an after-school program Michael had helped organize. Michael nodded. "Of course. Wouldn't miss it for the world." As Mia grabbed an apple and headed out the door, Dana leaned in closer. "You might be able to protect us from people, Michael, but what about the toll this is taking on you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he kissed her hand and said, "I'll be fine. I promise." The youth program. The after-school program was one of the initiatives born out of Michael and Amanda's coalition. Focused on mentoring at-risk youth, it aimed to provide a safe space for teenagers to talk about their challenges, learn new skills, and envision a brighter future. That afternoon, Michael sat in a circle with a group of teens, including Marcus, the boy who had shared his story at the community gathering. They were discussing what change meant to them. "For me, change means not having to look over my shoulder every time I walk down the street," said a girl named Layla. "It means being seen for who I am, not what people think I am." Marcus nodded. "Change is about opportunity," he said. "Like this program. Before this, I didn't think anyone cared." Michael listened intently, his heart swelling with pride and a touch of sadness. These kids weren't asking for much, just a chance to live without fear, to be seen and heard. When it was his turn to speak, he leaned forward. "Change starts with us," he said. "It starts with telling our stories, listening to each other, and refusing to accept things as they are. Each of you has the power to make a difference. Don't ever forget that." The breaking point. As the weeks went on, the threats against Michael escalated. One night, as he worked late in his home office, he heard a loud crash outside. Rushing to the window, he saw that someone had thrown a brick through the windshield of his car. Attached to the brick was a note that read, "Stop or else." Dana came running down the stairs, her face pale. "Michael, what's going on?" she demanded. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's just someone trying to scare us," he said, though his jaw tightened with anger. "I'll handle it." But it wasn't just the physical threats that weighed on him. The emotional toll of constantly justifying his work, of standing in the crossfire of mistrust and prejudice, was beginning to show. He found himself losing sleep, snapping at small things, and retreating into his thoughts more often. It was Amanda who noticed during one of their planning meetings. "You don't look like yourself," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Are you okay?" Michael shook his head. "I'm fine. Just tired." "Michael," she pressed, "you can't pour from an empty cup. If you burn out, who's going to keep this going?" Her words stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after the meeting ended. A moment of reflection. That weekend, Michael took his family to a nearby park, hoping to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. As he watched Mia and Caleb play on the swings, he felt a pang of guilt. Had he been too focused on the fight, and not enough on his family? Had he underestimated the strain this journey would put on all of them? Dana sat beside him on the bench, her hand resting on his arm. "You're doing important work," she said, as if reading his thoughts, "but you don't have to do it alone." Michael looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. I don't want to fail them," he said, nodding toward their children. "You won't," Dana assured him. "But part of being strong is knowing when to lean on others." An unexpected ally. The next day, Michael received a call from Sergeant James Miller, Amanda's partner. "Colonel Brooks, I've been meaning to reach out," he said. "I've been watching what you and Amanda are doing, and I want to help." Michael was surprised. While Miller had always been professional, he hadn't been particularly vocal about supporting their efforts. "What changed?" Michael asked. "I've been a cop for 15 years, Miller replied. "And in all that time, I've seen the good and the bad. I've seen officers who abuse their power, and I've seen people who've lost trust in us because of it. What you're doing, it's what we need. And I want to be part of the solution." Michael felt a flicker of hope. Having Miller on their side would add credibility to their work and help bridge the gap between the coalition and law enforcement. A new strategy. With Miller's support, Michael and Amanda proposed a new initiative. A joint task force composed of community members and police officers to address specific concerns and foster accountability. The proposal was met with mixed reactions, but after weeks of discussions and negotiations, it was approved. The task force held its first meeting in the community center. The room was filled with a mix of skepticism and optimism as people from both sides came together. Michael opened the meeting with a simple but powerful statement. "We're not here to fix the past. We can't. But we are here to build a better future. And that starts with listening, learning, and working together." The discussions were heated at times, but progress was made. By the end of the meeting, there was a sense of cautious hope. The tipping point. One evening, as Michael was driving home from a task force meeting, he noticed a car following him. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence, but when the car stayed on his tail for several miles, he grew uneasy. Pulling into a gas station, he stepped out and approached the driver of the other car. To his surprise, it was Marcus's mother. "Mrs. Harris," he said, confused. "Is everything okay?" She hesitated, then said, "Colonel Brooks, I wanted to thank you for what you've done for Marcus. He's talking about going to college now. something I never thought I'd hear. Michael smiled, his tension easing. Your son is incredible. He's going to do great things. As he drove away, Michael realized that moments like this, small but meaningful, were what made the fight worthwhile. For every threat, there was a Marcus. For every setback, there was a glimmer of hope, the victory within. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Michael Brooks's home, casting a warm glow on the dining room table where he sat. In front of him was a neatly typed speech he had been preparing for the culmination of months of work, the launch of a community-wide initiative that had grown from the seeds he and Amanda Hayes had planted. It was a moment that marked progress, but as Michael read over his words, he couldn't shake the mix of emotions coursing through him. This wasn't the end of the fight. It wasn't even a definitive victory, but it was a step forward. For Michael, that was enough. A day of reckoning. The event was being held at the largest civic center in town, its capacity stretched to accommodate the hundreds of people who had shown up. Community members, law enforcement officers, students, faith leaders, and local politicians filled the space, their presence a testament to the growing momentum behind Michael's work. As Michael walked onto the stage, he felt the weight of every moment that had led him here. The humiliating traffic stop, the anonymous threats, the sleepless nights spent grappling with self-doubt. The faces in the crowd reminded him of why he had persisted. For Marcus, for Mia and Caleb, for every person who had ever been judged unfairly. Amanda Hayes, sitting in the front row alongside Sergeant James Miller, gave him a small nod of encouragement. She had come a long way too, transforming from a symbol of mistrust to an ally who had committed herself to bridging divides. Michael took a deep breath, stepped up to the microphone, and began. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs in the crowd. "Today isn't about me. It isn't even about the incredible people sitting in this room. Today is about what we can achieve together when we refuse to accept the status quo." The speech that changed everything. Michael's speech wove together stories of resilience, compassion, and the power of community. He spoke of the teenagers in the mentoring program who now had hope for a brighter future. He recounted the moments of breakthrough in the task force meetings, where people from opposite sides of the divide had found common ground. But he didn't shy away from the challenges either. "We're not here to pat ourselves on the back," he said, his tone firm. "The work we've done so far is just the beginning. Real change requires persistence, humility, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, not just in others, but in ourselves." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I know there are some who still doubt this movement, who believe that the divides in our society are too deep to bridge. But I stand here today to tell you that they are wrong, because I've seen what's possible when people choose to listen instead of judge, to build instead of tear down." As he concluded, the crowd erupted into applause. But more than the applause, Michael noticed the expressions on people's faces: hope, determination, and a renewed sense of purpose. An unexpected encounter. After the event, Michael mingled with attendees, shaking hands and answering questions. As the crowd began to thin, he noticed an older man standing off to the side, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His face was weathered, his eyes shadowed by a baseball cap that bore the logo of a local veterans group. The man approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. "Colonel Brooks," he said, his voice gruff. "Can I have a word?" Michael nodded. "Of course. I'm Frank Mitchell," the man said. "Retired Marine Corps. I've been coming to these meetings, listening to what you have to say. I'll be honest, I wasn't sure about all this at first. Seemed like a lot of talk, not much action." Michael stayed silent, sensing there was more. "But I was wrong," Frank continued, his voice softening. "What you're doing, it's important. I see that now, and I want to help." Michael extended his hand, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "Thank you, Frank. Your support means more than you know." As Frank shook his hand, Michael realized that moments like these, a skeptic turned ally, were just as powerful as any program or initiative. A personal revelation. That evening, as Michael sat in his study reflecting on the day, his daughter Mia knocked on the door. "Come in," he said, setting aside his notes. Mia walked in, holding a school assignment. "I wrote this for English class," she said, handing him the paper. "It's about someone who inspires me." Michael began to read, his chest tightening with emotion as he took in her words. She had written about him, not just as her father, but as a role model who had taught her the value of courage, kindness, and standing up for what's right. "When I see my dad," the essay read, "I see someone who doesn't just talk about change. He makes it happen. And that makes me believe I can too." Michael looked up, his eyes misty. "Mia, this is incredible." She smiled shyly. "I just wanted you to know how proud I am of you." In that moment, Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. The work was far from over, but knowing that he was making a difference, not just in his community but in his own family, made every challenge worthwhile. The ripple effect. In the weeks that followed, the initiatives Michael and Amanda had launched began to show tangible results. The Joint Task Force implemented new policies for police accountability, including body cameras and mandatory cultural competency training. The mentoring program expanded to include job placement services, helping young people like Marcus secure internships and part-time work. The storytelling series gained traction, with videos being shared widely on social media. One clip, featuring Amanda Hayes sharing her journey from prejudice to understanding, went viral, sparking conversations in communities far beyond their own. The threats against Michael didn't disappear entirely, but they grew quieter. And as the positive impact of his work became more evident, the voices of opposition were drowned out by those of support. A new chapter. One sunny afternoon, as Michael sat on his porch enjoying a rare moment of quiet, Amanda pulled up in her patrol car. She stepped out, holding a folder. "What's this?" Michael asked as she handed it to him. "It's a proposal," Amanda said, "to take what we've done here and replicate it in other towns. We've had people reaching out, asking for guidance. I think we're onto something bigger than just this community." Michael opened the folder, skimming the document inside. It outlined a framework for building trust and accountability between law enforcement and communities, a blueprint based on their experiences. "This is good," he said, nodding. "Really good." Amanda smiled. "We make a good team." Michael laughed. Who would have thought? The victory within. As Michael watched Amanda drive away, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The work they had done wasn't perfect, and there was still a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope, not just for his community, but for himself. The true victory, he realized, wasn't in the policies they had implemented or the programs they had launched. It was in the hearts they had touched, the minds they had changed, and the barriers they had broken down. Michael stood, looking out at the quiet street that had once been the site of his greatest humiliation. Now it was the beginning of something greater, a legacy of courage, compassion, and the unyielding belief that change was possible.